The film I pulled from that development tank in October of 1952 showed a skeleton that had no business being inside a human body. I knew it the moment I clipped the wet sheet to the light board and the image resolved in front of me. I had been running a tuberculosis survey van through the hill counties of eastern Kentucky for 3 years at that point. I had x-rayed close to 4,000 people by that October. I knew what a human chest looked like on radiographic film the way a butcher knows the difference between cuts of meat. And what I was looking at on that board was not a human chest. Not entirely. The man had walked up to our van that morning just like everyone else in line. He had signed the paper with one hand and held his hat in the other, and when I positioned him against the plate and told him to breathe out and hold it, he did exactly what he was told. He was quiet, polite. The exposure took less than 2 seconds. He thanked me and walked away down the gravel road toward town, and I watched him go and thought nothing of it. Not until the film came out of the tank. I pulled that film before any doctor on our team had a chance to see it. I told the supervising physician, Dr. Horace Cantrell, that the plate had fogged during processing and was unreadable. He accepted that without question because fogged plates happened maybe twice a week on that equipment. I dropped the film into my personal kit bag under a change of clothes, and I kept it there for the rest of the survey. I drove it home with me when the circuit ended. I have kept it for 71 years. My name is Roy Elkins. I was born in 1929 in Harlan County, Kentucky, the son of a coal miner who died of silicosis in 1944 before I was old enough to follow him underground. That fact changed the direction of my life. My mother, a practical woman named Velma, decided that her son was not going into the mines, and she scraped together enough money from washing other people's clothes to send me to a vocational program at Berea College, where I trained in radiographic technology. By 1949, I had a certificate, a used car, and a job with the Kentucky State Department of Health, assigned to one of the mobile tuberculosis detection units that were then traveling through the most isolated parts of Appalachia, trying to get ahead of a disease that was still killing people at alarming rates. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. The tuberculosis campaign in Kentucky in the late 1940s and early 50s was one of the most significant public health operations in the state's history, and almost nobody outside the field remembers it now. TB had been endemic in the coal fields since the late 1800s. Overcrowded company housing, inadequate ventilation in the mines, poor nutrition, no access to consistent medical care. The disease moved through mining communities the way fire moves through dry grass. By the end of the 1940s, the state health department had assembled a fleet of converted trucks and buses, each fitted with portable fluoroscopic and radiographic equipment, and we drove those vehicles into places where there had never been a doctor and might never be one again. We set up in church parking lots, in schoolyards, on the gravel aprons in front of general stores. We announced ourselves by radio if a county had a station, by word of mouth if it didn't. People came out of the hollows and down from the ridges in numbers that sometimes surprised us. They weren't naive. They knew what TB did. They'd seen what it did. I was assigned to Survey Unit 7, a 1948 International Harvester KB series truck that had been converted with a darkroom in the rear and an X-ray apparatus bolted to the floor behind the cab. My partner was a licensed practical nurse named Beverly Sparks, who was from Breathitt County and spoke the dialect of the region fluently enough that people relaxed when they talked to her. The supervising physician rotated among the units and was not always physically present. On days when Dr. Cantrell was working a different unit, Beverly and I ran the operation ourselves. I took the films, Beverly collected the forms, and the images were reviewed by the physician at the end of each circuit. The mobile survey program had been operating in Kentucky since 1948, and by the time I joined in 49, the unit supervisors had accumulated a set of informal protocols for handling the specific challenges of the Hill County circuits that were not in any official manual. You did not park the van facing the road when working in a hollow, because the engine needed to be positioned uphill for the fuel pump to work reliably on steep grades. You carried chains even in September because the creek crossings that were passable on a dry October afternoon could be impassable mud by the same evening after a thunderstorm moved through. You kept a 3-day food supply in the cab because the health department's logistics routing did not account for roads that would sometimes wash out and strand you for a day or two without access to resupply. You kept the exposure logbook in a waterproof bag for the same reason. And you kept the development chemistry mixed at a slightly higher temperature than the manufacturer recommended because the creek water Beverly used to fill the developing tank ran colder than any water I had ever touched in September, and cold developer produced films that were too light to read confidently. Let me tell you something about what the survey work actually was, because I think it is easy to hear tuberculosis screening van and imagine something tidy and clinical. And the reality was not that. The health department provided the vehicle, the equipment, the film, and the development chemistry. They provided Beverly and me and a rotating physician supervisor who was stretched across 3 units. What they did not provide was anything like adequate preparation for what it meant to drive into communities that had been, in the most fundamental sense, abandoned by the economic structures of the country. Letcher County in 1952 had a median household income that ranked among the lowest in the state. The coal companies had been extracting coal from those mountains for 50 years by that point, and the wealth extracted had not stayed. It had gone to the company headquarters in Ashland and in Philadelphia and in New York. And what was left in the hollows were the men who had breathed coal dust for 30 years, and the women who had watched them sicken, and the children who were going to school in buildings that had not been painted since before the war.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Tuberculosis was not an abstraction in those communities. I had been trained to think of it as a public health problem, a disease with an epidemiology and a treatment protocol. And all of that was true. But in Letcher County in 1952, it was also something older and more personal than a public health problem. It was a fact of life that people organized their behavior around in ways that were intuitive and partly accurate and partly superstitious. And the intuitive and accurate parts had evolved because people had been living with TB in those mountains for generations and had learned, without being told by a public health department, which behaviors were associated with getting sick and which were associated with staying well. The people who came to the van were not naive about what we were doing. They were not confused about what a chest X-ray was for or what TB meant. Some of them had lost a parent or a sibling or a child to it. They came because they wanted to know, and they came despite the fact that knowing carried its own risks, because a positive screening result in 1952 meant a referral to a sanatorium, and in Letcher County in 1952 a sanatorium referral meant leaving the mountain and the family and the land and going somewhere else, maybe for years, and the economics of that were devastating for families that were already holding on by the skin of their teeth. The people who came to the van knew that. They came anyway. I respected them for it. Beverly had a gift for making that tolerable. She had grown up in a hollow in Breathitt County not fundamentally different from the hollows we were driving into, and she spoke to people without condescension, without the professional distance that public health workers sometimes put on as a kind of armor. She sat at her table in the church parking lot or the schoolyard, and she talked to people the way a neighbor talks to a neighbor. And people opened up in ways they would not have opened up for me, a young man from Harlan they had never seen before. The number of people who came through that van in the Letcher County circuit was higher than the historical average for the survey units in that region, and I have always thought Beverly was a significant reason for that. The equipment itself was a limitation I had learned to work around. The X-ray apparatus we were using in Survey Unit 7 was a portable unit manufactured by a company called Kelliket, a Cincinnati firm that had been making radiographic equipment since the 1920s. The unit had a fixed anode tube rated at 100 kilovolts peak and 20 milliamperes, which was adequate for chest radiography but did not give me the range of technique factors that a hospital unit would have allowed. I was working with a single set of exposure parameters, adjusted slightly for patient size, and producing film that was diagnostically adequate for tuberculosis screening purposes, meaning I could see the lung fields and the major structures clearly enough to identify active disease. But that was not the same as the quality achievable in a dedicated radiographic suite. This matters because it means the films I produced of Caleb Holt were not optimized for skeletal analysis. The technique I used was optimized for lung tissue visibility. Lung tissue is soft, relatively low density, and requires a technique that will adequately penetrate the chest without overexposing the lungs. At that technique, dense structures like bone can appear more brilliant than they would at a technique optimized for bone imaging, because the bone is being imaged with somewhat less penetrating radiation than bone imaging normally uses. This could, in principle, make bones appear denser on the image than they actually are. I thought about this objection for a long time. In the years after I had more experience with the physics of image formation, and I concluded that it did not change my interpretation of what I saw, for the following reason. I had produced thousands of chest films on the same equipment at the same technique before and after October of '52. I had a calibrated sense of what bone looked like on a Survey Unit 7 chest film at standard technique. The cortical opacity in Caleb Holt's ribs was beyond anything in that calibrated reference range. The technique factor could account for a slight increase in apparent density above the true density, but not for an increase of the magnitude I observed. If anything, the technique factor was working against the finding, because the standard technique for a large-chested man would typically involve a slight increase in kilovoltage to ensure adequate penetration, which would have produced somewhat less cortical brilliance rather than more. I used that standard adjustment for his film based on my assessment of his chest size. His ribs were still brighter than any I had seen. In October of 1952, we were running a circuit through Letcher County, which sits in the southeastern corner of Kentucky, pressed against the Virginia border. The county seat is Whitesburg, but we spent most of that week in the smaller communities along the creek drainages, places like Eolia and Millstone and McRoberts, and the smaller settlements above those that didn't have names on most maps. The terrain in Letcher County is typical of the Cumberland Plateau. Steep ridges running roughly northeast to southwest, cut by creek valleys so narrow in places that the roads followed the creek beds themselves and you were fording water to get from one house to the next. The hardwood forest comes right down to the road edges. And in October, the canopy was in full color, orange and scarlet, and the deep rust of dying oak leaves, so thick overhead, in places that it felt like driving through a stained glass tunnel. On the morning of October 14th, we had set up in the parking lot of a Holiness Church about 4 miles above Jenkins, on a road that followed Elkhorn Creek north. The church was a white frame building with a hand-lettered sign out front, and by 9 in the morning, there were already 20 people lined up along the side of the building. Families mostly, a few old men who had walked down from the ridge above. Beverly was at the table with her forms, collecting names and dates of birth and addresses, and I was in the back of the truck warming up the equipment and checking the developer chemistry. The man came at about 10:30. I noticed him before he reached the table because he was tall enough to stand out in the line. Taller than anyone else there, by a significant measure, and he was wearing a canvas work jacket with the collar turned up despite the fact that it was a mild morning, probably 55 degrees and sunny. He had a hat pulled low, a dark felt hat with the brim bent in the front, the kind of hat working men wore in that region at that time. He kept his eyes down. When he reached Beverly's table, he gave his name as Caleb Holt and listed his address as a rural route number, Route 3, with no town specified, which was not unusual for that part of the county where addresses were informal at best. Beverly noted his age as 34, though she told me later, when I pressed her, that she had been uncertain about it. She said his face didn't match 34. She said he looked both younger and older at the same time, which didn't make sense when she said it and didn't make more sense later when I thought about it, except that I understood exactly what she meant. He climbed into the back of the truck when it was his turn, which required him to duck considerably to clear the door frame. I told him to remove his jacket and stand against the plate with his back to me and his arms slightly forward, and he did this without any difficulty. He understood the instructions and followed them without having them repeated. Some people needed 3 or 4 repetitions before they positioned themselves correctly. He positioned himself on the first word. His back was to me when he removed his jacket, and I remember noticing that his shoulders were exceptional in width, broader than the width of the cassette plate, which was a 14 by 17-inch field. I had to ask him to shift forward slightly to center him on the plate. And when he did, I saw that even centered, his shoulder width was going to approach the edges of the exposure field. I made the exposure. He dressed, thanked me in a voice that was quiet and slightly low in register, and stepped down out of the truck. I watched him walk away down the road toward the creek. He walked with a gait I could not quite characterize. Not a limp, not exactly, more a quality of movement in the hips and knees that was fluid, and the quality of it seemed slightly wrong for the construction of the human body, the way a very large animal can seem to move too smoothly for its own size. I watched him until he turned at the bend in the road, and then I went back to my equipment. The film came out of the developer tank 40 minutes later. I clipped it to the light board in the darkroom section of the truck, which was just a small compartment behind a heavy curtain, lit by a single safe light bulb when the outer door was closed, and switched on the illuminator. I stood there for probably 2 full minutes before I moved. I want to be precise about what I was seeing and what I was not seeing, because over the years, I have told this story to exactly 3 people, and each time I have had to fight the temptation to embellish, to make it more dramatic than it was, and I have refused that temptation because the plain facts are dramatic enough, and the plain facts are what happened. The skeletal structure visible in the chest radiograph was human in its basic organization. 2 lungs, a heart shadow in the expected position, a thoracic spine running vertically down the center of the image, ribs arcing outward from the spine on both sides. TB survey films were chest only, 14 by 17 inches, covering roughly from the clavicles down to the bottom margin of the lung fields. I was not imaging the full body. What I had was a chest plate, and within that chest plate the gross anatomy was recognizably human, but the individual structures within that recognizable organization were not. The ribs were the first thing. A human thoracic cage has 12 pairs of ribs. The standard anatomical arrangement is 7 true ribs connecting directly to the sternum via costal cartilage, 3 false ribs connecting to the cartilage above them, and 2 floating ribs at the bottom that connect to nothing at the front. You learn this in radiographic training and you stop thinking about it because it is always the same. The man I was looking at appeared to have 13 pairs of ribs, with the additional pair positioned below what I could identify as the lowest floating ribs, angling outward and slightly downward at an orientation that I had never seen on any film I had ever produced. I counted 3 times. 13 pairs. The extra pair was not vestigial. They were full-length ribs, substantial on the image. The cortical bone density was wrong. On a normal chest film, the ribs have a certain opacity on the image, a grayish white that varies with the patient's age and general health. Dense bone in a young, healthy adult appears white. Older bone, or bone in someone with nutritional deficiency, appears lighter, more translucent. The ribs in this film were brilliant white at their cortices. White to a degree I associated with abnormal calcification or with some artifact of overexposure, except that the film was not overexposed. The lung fields were appropriately gray. The soft tissue shadows were correct. Only the bone was reading at that unusual density. The clavicles were longer than standard anatomy allows. I could see both clavicles, the collarbones, running from the shoulder joints inward toward the sternum, and they extended further laterally than they should have, consistent with that exceptional shoulder width I had observed when he was standing in front of the plate. A human clavicle averages about 6 inches in length. though there is natural variation. These appeared, by rough estimation against the known dimensions of the film and the approximate scaling of the image, to be closer to 9 or 10 inches. That is not a trivial difference. That is a structural departure. The scapulae, the shoulder blades, were only partially visible at the edges of the frame, but what I could see of them suggested a surface area larger than any I had imaged. The glenoid cavity, the socket of the shoulder joint, was at the extreme lateral edge of the film on both sides, nearly off the plate, and that alone should not have been possible given the centering I had done. I looked at the lung fields themselves for a long time after I had catalogued the skeletal anomalies. This was, after all, a tuberculosis survey. The purpose of the film was to identify pulmonary pathology, and I was trained to look at the lungs first, the skeleton second. The lungs were clear. No opacification, no cavitation, no hilar lymphadenopathy, no pleural fluid. Whatever Caleb Holt was, his lungs were healthy. I stood there in that dark room with the film on the light board, and I went through every rational explanation I could construct. Equipment malfunction producing image distortion, processing error creating artifact, a film from a previous patient that had somehow been mixed into the sequence. Double exposure, though the mechanics of my cassette system made this essentially impossible. I went through the list and I eliminated each item in turn. And at the end of the list, I was left with one conclusion, which was that the film accurately represented the internal structure of the man who had stood against my plate that morning. I thought about Dr. Cantrell. I thought about what would happen if I showed him this film. In the field of radiology in 1952, an anomalous finding of this magnitude would have triggered a reporting chain that I could not have controlled and could not have predicted. The man had signed a consent form. He had given his name and address. He could be located. And whatever he was, whatever his biology was, I was not prepared to be the technician who handed that information to a government health department chain of command and watched what happened next. I do not know exactly why I made the decision I made. I have thought about it for over 70 years, and I have not arrived at a clean explanation. Part of it was the look on his face when he was signing the form, which I had only seen from a distance, but which Beverly had described to me later that afternoon, unprompted, before I told her anything about the film. She said he looked cautious, not frightened, just cautious in the way of a person who has learned to be careful in a world that does not understand them. Part of it was something my mother used to say, that the men who worked the mines developed a kind of radar for the company men who were there to count them rather than to help them, and that the worst thing you could do to a man who was already being counted was to count him again. I am not sure that reasoning entirely holds up, but it was there. I told Dr. Cantrell the film had fogged. I put it in my kit bag, and that evening, sitting in the cab of the survey truck while Beverly drove us back toward Whitesburg on a road that followed the creek in the dark, I thought about the extra ribs and the bone density and those clavicles, and I thought about the figure walking away down the road toward the creek bend, moving with that fluid gait that was not quite right for a human body. I did not sleep well that night. I did not sleep well for several nights after that. The survey van had a logbook. Every exposure made, every plate processed, every result recorded by date and by a sequential frame number that matched the cassette load. The logbook went to Dr. Cantrell at the end of each day, and he compared it against his own tally of patient forms. If the numbers did not match, he asked why. On the afternoon of October 14th, I had made, by the logbook, 37 exposures. By the patient form count, Beverly had registered 38 people. The discrepancy of one was the fogged plate, which I had listed in the logbook as frame 22. Exposure failure due to cassette light seal compromise, and I had noted that the cassette had been pulled from service and would be returned to the supply depot for repair. That cassette was, in fact, still in perfect working condition. I put it back in rotation the following morning. The reason I am telling you this is that for the first week after I took that film, the logbook was the thing I thought about more than the film itself. Not because I believed Dr. Cantrell would investigate the discrepancy in any depth, but because the logbook was the physical record of my deception, and it sat in the cab of the van where I could see it every time I drove. I had been, in my professional life up to that point, a careful and honest man. I had not been dishonest about records. That was not a line I had expected to cross. What I told myself in that first week was that I had not falsified the record. I had reported the plate as unusable and had removed the cassette from service. Both of those things were true in a limited technical sense, since the plate was not going to be submitted for medical review. What I had not reported was why the plate was being suppressed, and that omission was, in any honest accounting, the same as a falsehood. I knew it then, and I know it now. I did not lose sleep over it in any way that suggested guilt. I lost sleep because I was thinking about what I had seen, which is a different kind of wakefulness entirely. Beverly noticed I was quieter than usual for the remainder of that week. She mentioned it on the Thursday, not unkindly, just noting it, and added that the Letcher County runs always seemed to wear people down, something about the terrain and the distance from anywhere resembling a city, and she asked if I was sleeping all right. I told her I was, and she accepted that and went back to her forms. Beverly Sparks was a tactful woman. She had a quality common to people who grow up in small, close communities, which is an understanding of when not to press. The mountain people she had grown up among had their own version of leave well enough alone, and it had rubbed off on her in ways that made her invaluable as a partner in the kind of work we did, which required going into places where strangers were not automatically trusted and extracting cooperation through patience and courtesy rather than authority. I respected her for it, and I was grateful for it that particular week. The physical film was my larger concern. I could not carry it in my kit bag indefinitely. The kit bag was a canvas satchel that I kept at my feet in the cab of the van, and it was examined occasionally when we went through the loading and inventory checks that the health department required at the beginning and end of each circuit. Not thoroughly examined. Nobody was looking for contraband in a tuberculosis technician's personal gear, but it was handled, and the film was a 14 by 17-inch piece of cellulose acetate that would have been recognizable as a chest radiograph to anyone who looked closely at the bag's contents. On the Friday of that week, I drove into Whitesburg during the lunch break and went into the hardware store on Main Street, where I bought a length of brown paper wrapping material and a cardboard tube, the kind used for mailing posters or architectural drawings, that was close enough to the film dimensions to contain it without folding. I wrapped the film in the brown paper, slid it into the tube, and sealed the tube at both ends with tape. I wrote my mother's address in Harlan on the outside and put it in the post office the same afternoon, marked personal documents, with a brief note inside to my mother saying I had sent her something for safekeeping and she should put it in the closet without opening it, and I would explain when I saw her at Christmas. My mother was not a woman who opened things she had been told not to open. She put the tube in the hall closet and did not mention it when I came home for Christmas, and I collected it on my way back through Harlan in January of '53. By then, I had already mailed Arvin Combs my letter and was beginning to think about how to get back to Letcher County for the follow-up circuit. The tube went into the storage cabinet in my apartment in Frankfort, behind a stack of textbooks from my training program, and it stayed there until I moved to Lexington in '55. The boarding house we used when we were working Letcher County was run by a woman named Mrs. Connie Gabbard in Whitesburg. She kept 4 rooms on the second floor, rented them to surveyors and road crew and traveling salesmen, and she served breakfast and dinner family style at a table that seated 12, which meant that the guests ate together whether they wanted to or not. On the 3rd evening after the Elkhorn Creek survey, I was sitting at that table across from a man named Earl Stidham, who drove timber for a lumber company working the headwaters above Jenkins. He was a large man himself, Not in any abnormal sense, just big the way mountain men got big from hard physical work over a lifetime, and he had the easy directness of someone who spent most of his time either alone in the woods or among people he had known for decades. I do not know what led me to bring it up. The conversation had been about the weather, and then about the condition of the roads above Jenkins, which had been washed out in several places by a heavy rain the week before. And then, without planning to, I asked Earl Stidham if he had ever seen anything unusual in the woods above the creek drainages. He looked at me over his coffee cup for a moment. Not a long moment, just a beat. Then he set the cup down and said, "Unusual how?" I said I was not sure. I said I had heard people in the area talk about things in the woods that were hard to account for. This was not entirely untrue. In the weeks of doing survey work in these counties, I had heard, on more than one occasion, passing references to things seen at dusk in the tree lines, to prints found in creek mud that were larger than any man's, to the sound of wood being struck against wood deep in the forest at night. These references were always brief, always offhand, delivered in the tone people use when they are mentioning something real that they do not intend to argue about. I had not paid them particular attention at the time. Earl Stidham looked at me for another moment, and then he said, "You asking about the big ones?" It was not a question. I said I supposed I was. My grandfather called them the old ones. Said they'd been here before the first white man came through the gap, before the Cherokee, before anybody. Said they're not what most people think they are. He picked up his coffee cup again. Most people that see one don't talk about it because they know what happens when you talk about it. You get a name, and not a good name. I asked him if he had seen one himself. More than once. Last time was 3 years ago, up on the ridge above the Bull Creek drainage. It was standing in the edge of the tree line, watching me clear a skid road. Just standing there. I stopped my saw and looked at it, and it looked at me, and then it turned and went back into the trees. That's how it usually goes if you're not foolish about it. I did not tell him about the film that night. I was not ready to tell anyone about the film. Earl Stidham ate his dinner and we talked about other things, and when he excused himself from the table that evening, he paused at the doorway and said, without turning around, "The ones that end badly are the ones where somebody went looking, just so you know." Then he went upstairs. I did not see him again because we were moving to a different site the following morning, and he was heading further up into the timber the same day. I thought about what he said for a long time. The ones that end badly. He had said it with a matter-of-factness that implied he was reporting an observation rather than issuing a warning, the way a man reports on the weather or the condition of the roads. He had seen at least 2, by his accounting, and he had been in the woods long enough to accumulate a set of learned behaviors around those encounters, and one of the learned behaviors was, do not go looking. The encounter that goes well is the encounter where you stop your saw and look at it and it looks at you, and then you both turn and go on with your days. The encounter that does not go well is something else, the product of a decision to pursue. He had not said what that looked like. I did not ask. I filed it alongside the other things I was collecting in those months. The conversation with Earl, Arvin Combs's letter about the mailbox on the post, the fragment Beverly had offered about the man at the form table and his deliberate quality of making sure she was not frightened. Each piece added a dimension to what had been, in October, a purely radiographic finding. The finding had told me about his skeleton. The subsequent information was telling me about his life, the care with which it was structured, the relationships it depended on, the geography it was adapted to. I thought about the woman in Whitesburg that Caleb had mentioned in our April conversation, the one who had been his mother's closest friend, and who had helped establish his documentary existence after his mother died in 1934. A human woman, presumably elderly by 1953, who had known his mother well enough to be the closest friend, which implied a relationship of real intimacy, real trust. A woman who knew what she was keeping and had kept it. That was the other thing the months of thinking had clarified for me. He was not alone in his situation in the sense of being completely isolated from human knowledge and support. He had relationships. Not many. Not close in the way of people who lived near each other and saw each other regularly, but relationships with specific individuals who understood enough of his situation to be useful to him and who had chosen to be useful rather than to report. The woman in Whitesburg, whoever had been Arvin Combs's predecessor on the mail route before Combs, possibly others I did not know about. A small, quiet network of people who knew what they were protecting and had made a private decision to protect it. I was being invited to join that network. That was how I understood what was happening in April. He had come back not just to find out what I intended to do with the film, but to give me the information I would need to make a decision about whether I wanted to keep his confidence. He had told me about his father, his mother, his age, his situation with the mail and the hollow in the house. He had given me enough of the story that, if I was going to tell it, I would be telling it with detail and specificity rather than as a vague rumor. And he had done this not recklessly, not because he trusted everyone, but because he had read me correctly from 30 feet in October and had concluded that the reading was accurate, that I was the kind of person who would make the choice he hoped I would make. That level of judgment about people, about situations, about when to trust and when to withhold, was the thing that struck me most powerfully when I thought about him in those months. He was 61 years old, by his own accounting. He had been navigating a world that required constant, precise assessment of who was safe and who was not. He had developed, over those 61 years, a perceptual acuity for the relevant signals that I could not fully imagine. I had been on the receiving end of it for about 30 seconds, the time it took him to watch him walk away from the van, and I had been read correctly. That was a skill built on something that I could not account for by experience alone. 61 years of practice. Yes, but also, I thought, a biology that had been shaped by the same pressures that had shaped the bone density and the rib count. Something in the perceptual system, the social cognition, that had been refined under the same selection pressures. A lineage that had been surviving in proximity to a world that would not tolerate it for a very long time had not survived by accident. But I kept thinking about what he said, about the old ones, about how long they had been here. And I thought about what I had seen on that light board, the extra ribs and the bone density I have described, and I began to understand that what I had imaged in the back of that survey truck was not an aberration, not a pathology, not a one-of-a-kind anomaly. It was a member of a population, and Caleb Holt, the man who had signed Beverly's form with a rural route number and no town, was living in these mountains not because he was hiding, but because the mountains were where his people had always lived. I finished the Letcher County circuit the following week and drove back to Frankfort to file my forms with the state health department. The form for Caleb Holt listed his X-ray result as film exposure failure, uninterpretable, and recommended rescreening, which was the standard notation for a fogged plate. It sat in the health department files for whatever period records from that era were retained. I have no way of knowing whether it is still there. Probably not. The state tuberculosis control program was wound down through the late 1950s and early 60s as the disease came under control, and the administrative records from the mobile survey units are not the kind of thing that was prioritized for long-term preservation. I kept thinking about the rural route number, Route 3, no town. Beverly had not thought much of it. Rural addresses in that part of Letcher County were loose, she noted, and plenty of people listed route numbers that corresponded to mail routes rather than to any official address system. But I had driven enough of those roads to know that Route 3 above Jenkins was a mail carrier designation that served the upper reaches of several creek drainages, some of them very remote, and the idea that someone with that bone structure and those dimensions was living on a rural route with a mailbox somewhere was an idea I kept coming back to. In November of that year, I requested a transfer to Survey Unit 4, which was running circuits through Harlan County, the county where I had grown up. The request was approved without difficulty. The health department moved technicians among units regularly, and no one asked for a reason. My supervisor assumed I wanted to be closer to home. He was not wrong about that, but he was wrong about which version of home I was thinking about. I had grown up in Harlan County, but I had not spent much time in Letcher County as a child. They border each other, and the geography is similar, but the communities are distinct, and the social networks do not overlap much. However, I had cousins in Pike County, which is east of Letcher, and through those cousins I had a loose acquaintance with a man named Arvin Combs who had worked for decades as a rural mail carrier in the upper reaches of the county. Arvin was in his 70s by 1952, mostly retired but still covering one partial route because the postmaster could not find anyone else willing to drive it. I wrote him a letter in November. I did not ask him directly about Caleb Holt. I asked him about the delivery patterns on routes in the upper Elkhorn Creek drainages, and I asked, with what I tried to make sound like casual professional curiosity, whether there were any households in that area that received medical or government correspondence that he recalled. Arvin wrote back in December, a brief letter in the cramped, carefully formed handwriting of a man who had not written much but who meant everything he put on paper. He said the upper drainages above Jenkins on Route 3 were served by him twice a week, weather permitting, and that there were 3 households he delivered to above the Second Creek Ford that were, as he put it, back in there a good ways. He said 2 of them had names he knew, families that had been in those hollows for generations. The third, he said, was a household he had been delivering to for about 6 years, since around 1946. And the recipient name on the mail was C. Holt. He had never once seen anyone at that address. He would leave the mail in a wooden box on a post at the road edge, and the next time he came through, it would be gone. He had never knocked on the door. The track to the house, he said, was more than a mile from the road, going up a hollow that he could not see the end of from where he turned around. C. Holt, with a mailbox on a post at the road edge, a mile from the actual structure, in a hollow that Arvin Combs had never walked to the end of. I asked Beverly about him in January of '53. We were on a circuit in Floyd County by then, a long way from Letcher, but I had been thinking about the form she had collected from him for 3 months. I told her I had found a discrepancy in a record and needed to clarify some details, and I described the man she had registered on October 14th, without naming him. I described his height and his hat and the canvas jacket with the turned-up collar. I asked her what she remembered about the interaction. She was quiet for a moment, looking out the truck window at the gray February hillside. Then she said, "He had a courtesy about him that I don't often see, like he was being very deliberate about making sure I wasn't frightened." She paused, which is a strange thing to say about a man standing in line to get his chest x-rayed, but that's what it felt like he was aware of the effect he had, and he was going out of his way to minimize it. I asked her if she had noticed anything unusual about his hands when he signed the form. She looked at me for a moment. "I noticed his hand was big," she said. "The pen looked small in it, but plenty of men around here have big hands." She looked at me more carefully. "Why are you asking me about this?" I told her the film had come out fine after all. I told her I had re-examined it and thought there might be a density anomaly worth following up on. This was not the truth, but it was the closest thing to the truth I was prepared to offer at that moment. Beverly was a perceptive woman, and I believe she knew I was not telling her everything. She did not press me. She went back to her forms, but I noticed that she did not mention the conversation again. Not for the remaining 2 years we worked together on the survey units, not in any of the letters we exchanged after that when she moved back to Breathitt County to care for her mother. She mentioned him once, at the very end, in a card she sent me in 1967, when I had moved my practice to Lexington. She said she hoped I had found what I was looking for up in the upper hollows. She did not explain what she meant by that, and I did not respond to it directly. I have always believed she knew more than she said, and chose to keep it the way I chose to keep it, which is to say, locked in a private place where it would not cause harm to anyone. After Floyd County, I put in for a posting that would get me back into Letcher County. The health department was running a follow-up circuit in the spring of '53, targeting communities that had shown elevated TB rates in the previous year's survey. Letcher County had 2 such communities. I volunteered. My supervisor was pleased to have someone willing to go back into that terrain. We ran the Letcher follow-up in April of '53. I had 6 months by then to think about what I was going to do if I saw Caleb Holt again. I had not arrived at a satisfying plan. I was not a man who believed in direct confrontation as a default strategy. What I had was a film in my kit bag and a set of questions that I had no right to ask and no framework to ask them in. On the second day of the Letcher circuit, we were set up in a churchyard above Eolia, a community a few miles north of Jenkins along Elkhorn Creek. The day was cool and clear, a good day for survey work, and the turnout was reasonable. Maybe 40 people through the van by mid-morning. At about 10:45, I saw him at the end of the line. He was wearing different clothes, a heavier jacket this time, dark wool, and the same style of felt hat. He was standing about 8 people back from the table where Beverly was collecting forms, and he was looking at the van rather than at anything else in the churchyard. Not looking at me, looking at the van as if he was considering something about it. Then he looked at me. The distance between us was about 30 feet. He looked at me directly, and I looked at him directly, and I had the distinct sensation that he knew exactly who I was, and that this was not a coincidence. He had come back. He had come back to a health survey van in the same general area where he had presented 6 months earlier, and when his eyes found mine, there was recognition in them. He stayed in the line. When his turn came, he walked to Beverly's table and signed the form again. I could not see what name he put down from where I was standing. He came to the van when it was his turn, ducked through the door, and stood against the plate when I told him to. He did not speak, and neither did I during the positioning. When he was in place, I said, "Hold still," and he held still, and I made the exposure. When he stepped down out of the truck afterward, I said, "I'd like to speak with you for a moment if you don't mind." He stopped. He looked at me with those eyes that were slightly too far apart. That was the other thing I had noticed in October, and confirmed now in the closer quarters of the van interior, set slightly wider than standard human proportions, enough that it produced a subtle quality of broadness in his face that I had attributed initially to the hat brim and the low angle at which he kept his head. He looked at me and he said, "All right." We walked to the far side of the churchyard, away from the line and away from Beverly's table. There was a stand of bare-leafed sycamore trees along the fence line there, and we stood in the shade of them, and I was aware that from the van and from the line, the angle and the trees made us only partially visible. I said, "I kept the film from October." He nodded. One slow nod. I said, "I told my supervisor it had fogged." He said, "I know." I asked him how he knew. I wasn't certain, but the way you watched me walk away from the van, I thought you might have. He paused. "I came back to find out what you intended to do with it." I want to try to give you a sense of this conversation as accurately as I can, because it was not what I would have expected if I had imagined it in advance. There was no drama to it, no urgency. He spoke carefully and quietly, with a cadence that was slightly formal, not in the way of someone performing formality, but in the way of someone who had learned language from sources that were themselves formal, old books maybe, or from people who had learned it the same way. His vocabulary was precise. He chose words with deliberateness, and behind all of that there was a quality of patience that I can only describe as geologic. The patience of something that does not experience time the way I did. I told him I didn't intend to do anything with the film that would cause him trouble. I told him I was a technician, not a physician, and that the film had never been seen by a physician and would not be. I told him the health department record showed the exposure as unusable, which meant there was no official documentation of what I had seen. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" I said I wasn't sure I could explain it completely. I said that when I saw him walk away from the van in October, I had thought of something my mother used to say about men who did not want to be counted, and I had decided he deserved to not be counted if that was what he wanted. He looked at me for a long moment. The sycamore trees were moving slightly in the wind, and the light through the bare branches made a pattern on the ground around us. He said, "You grew up in the coal fields." I said I had. He said, "Then you understand what happens to things that are found and named and classified before they're ready to be." I said I thought I did. He said, "The film, do you still have it?" I said I did. He said, "I would like to know what it showed." I told him. I stood in that churchyard with the bare sycamore trees and the survey van 20 yards behind me, and I told Caleb Holt what his own skeleton looked like on radiographic film. I told him about the extra pair of ribs. I told him about the cortical bone density. I told him about the clavicles and the shoulder width. I told him everything I had seen on that light board in the darkroom compartment of Survey Unit 7 on the afternoon of October 14th, 1952. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably about 30 seconds. Then he said, 13 pairs. I said yes. He said, "My father had 14. I did not know what to say to that. I said nothing, which was probably the correct response. He said, "My mother had 12, the same as you." He said it simply, without self-consciousness, as a statement of genetic fact. My mother had 12 pairs of ribs, the same as any human being, and he was the product of that difference, carrying 13 pairs because 13 was where the two lines met. I stood there and listened to him say this, and I thought about what it meant that there was a line on one side of his family that carried 14 pairs of ribs and another on the other side that carried 12, and that these two lines had intersected in a single person who was standing in a Kentucky churchyard in April of '53 in a dark wool jacket and a felt hat, telling me about it in a voice that was quiet and precise and entirely without apparent distress. I asked him how old he was, not to challenge the age on Beverly's form, but because I genuinely did not know, and because the quality of patience I had mentioned seemed to imply something about duration. He said, "By your counting, 61. I looked at him. By any visual assessment, he was a man of perhaps 35, maybe 40 at the upper edge. The face under that hat brim was not a face of 61 years. I said as much. He said, "We age differently." And then he said, "Or we don't age. Exactly. We change on a different schedule." I asked about his father. I asked whether his father was still living. His father had been born, by his best calculation, somewhere around 1850, and had died in 1938 at what would have been, in those terms, an age of about 88 years. At 88, his father had not appeared markedly older than Caleb appeared now. The physical changes that in human beings accumulate continuously over decades were, in his father's line, compressed and then delayed, so that a person could appear essentially unchanged for long periods and then shift rapidly toward an older presentation in a relatively short window near the end. I asked about his mother. His mother was from a family that had lived in the upper Elkhorn drainage for at least 3 generations back as far as anyone in that family's memory could confirm. She was a human woman. He said it that way. A human woman, in a tone that was matter of fact. She had been born in 1890 and had died in 1934 of pneumonia. She had been 44 years old. He said this without apparent emotion, though the absence of emotion in the recounting felt not like coldness but like the compression of something very large into a very small space. I asked him where he lived. I was thinking of the rural route number and the mailbox on the post and Arvin Combs's twice-weekly run up the hollow. He said he lived on the upper fork of the drainage above Jenkins, in a house that his mother's family had built. He said he had been living there since he was a child. He said the mail arrived twice a week, when the road was passable. He said he went to town when he needed to, and otherwise people generally left him alone, and he left them alone. And this arrangement had worked well for the past 2 decades. I asked him whether his presence there was known to anyone. I mean, in any official capacity. Did anyone in the county understand what he was? He thought about this. There were perhaps 5 or 6 people in the county, he told me, in the county, who understood, or understood enough. Older people, mostly. A man who had been the previous mail carrier on his route before Arvin Combs. A woman in Whitesburg who had been his mother's closest friend and who had been the one to write the letters that had established his address and his existence on paper in the years after his mother died, so that he would have some documentation in a world that increasingly required it. These people had not spoken about what they knew and would not speak about it. I asked him why he had come to the health survey van. Either time. Exine. He said the first time, in October, he had come because he had heard the van was doing tuberculosis screening and there had been TB cases in 2 families in the upper drainage that he was aware of, and he had been uncertain enough about his own susceptibility that he wanted to know. I asked if he was susceptible. He said he did not know. He said his immune response to ordinary infections was robust. Substantially more robust than what he observed in the human people around him, and that he had never contracted any illness that he was aware of in his 61 years. But tuberculosis was not an ordinary infection. It behaved differently from most respiratory pathogens in ways that his general robustness might not protect against. He had wanted confirmation that his lungs were clear. I told him they were clear. I told him the lung fields in his film were negative for any finding consistent with active or past tuberculosis infection. He said he was glad to know that. Then he said, "The film, what will you do with it?" I said I would keep it. I said I had no plans to show it to anyone or to produce it in any official context. I said as far as I was concerned it was a piece of equipment output from a job I had done, and what I did with my equipment output was my own business. He looked at me for a moment with those wide-set eyes. And then he said, "All right." The words had a finality that felt like the closing of something, a door being closed from both sides simultaneously. He turned and walked away across the churchyard, around the corner of the white-frame church, and was gone. I went back to the van and developed his April film that afternoon, and the findings were identical to the October film. 13 pairs of ribs, dense cortical bone, clavicles at the edge of the frame, clear lung fields. I kept that film too. We talked for perhaps 15 minutes in that churchyard. There were specific things he told me that I want to set down plainly, because they bear on questions that I have spent decades turning over, and because I am at a point in my life where leaving them inside my own head serves no purpose. I asked him about the population. I asked it obliquely, not because I was trying to be indirect, but because I was not sure how to phrase it. I asked if there were others like him in the mountains. Others meaning, and I hope he understood what I meant, others who carried the same biological inheritance, the same ancestry on one side that his father had carried. He thought about this for a moment. He said, "Not nearby. Not in this county, to my knowledge." He said knowledge with a weight that implied the question was meaningful to him, that he had in fact given thought to it and had arrived at an answer he was reasonably confident in. He said there had been, in his father's time, other individuals in the region who carried that inheritance, some more fully than he carried it, some less. He said his father had known of perhaps 4 or 5 others within what he described as a day's travel, which I understood to mean a day's travel on foot through mountain terrain, which in the Cumberlands could mean 20 or 30 miles. By the time Caleb was grown, he said, he knew of 2. By the time I was speaking with him in '53, he knew of none. He had not encountered anyone he believed shared his father's lineage in perhaps 10 years. I asked what had happened to them. He was quiet for a moment. He said some had died. He said the others, he believed, had moved. He used the word moved carefully, with the care of someone choosing it over other words. The mountains of eastern Kentucky were not what they had been before the coal companies arrived. The arrival of the extractive industry in the 1890s had changed the landscape and the population density of the region in ways that had made the kind of careful, low-profile existence he maintained increasingly difficult. His father had watched the railroad come into Jenkins and Benham and Lynch and had known what it meant. His father had not moved. His father had decided to stay and had managed, through a combination of strategic reclusiveness and the protection of a small number of trusted human relationships, to maintain his existence in the upper drainage until his death in 1938. But others had not stayed, and he could not say where they had gone. I asked whether they would have gone north, west, further into the mountains. He said he did not know. He said his father had spoken occasionally of kin in the ranges to the west, the Ozarks, the ranges of West Virginia to the north. Those references were vague, the kind of thing that a person mentions when discussing family history without intending it as actionable geography. He could not say whether those references reflected actual known individuals or were themselves passed down stories about a time when the population of his father's people had been larger and more dispersed. I thought about that for a long time afterward. A population that had once been larger, distributed across the mountain ranges of the eastern continent, and that had contracted over the preceding century as the industrial economy pushed into the last remaining isolated hollows, contracting not through extinction, exactly, but through dispersal and obscurity, individuals and small family groups moving away from the pressure of being found, going somewhere that the roads had not yet reached, or the coal companies had not yet surveyed, going somewhere they could continue to do what Caleb Holt was doing in the upper Elkhorn drainage, living carefully, having mail delivered to a box on a post at the road edge. There was one more thing he said that I have thought about often. I asked him whether he had any concern about being X-rayed, not medically, but in terms of what the image might reveal. I asked whether he had considered the risk before he walked up to Beverly's table in October. He had calculated it, he told me. He told me the survey van was a state health department operation, not a research program, and that the purpose of the films was clinical screening, not skeletal analysis. He noted that in a clinical screening context, the reviewing physician would be looking at lung fields, not at rib counts or cortical density. He added that even if the anomalies were noticed, the most probable response in a public health survey context was to flag the patient for follow-up, not to initiate an investigation into the patient's ancestry. The risk, he concluded, was manageable. The greater risk, he said, was not knowing about the tuberculosis. I had been in contact with 2 families in the upper drainage who had active cases. I could not verify my own status through any other means that was available to me. He spoke in the same precise, considered tone in which he said everything, and I realized as he was saying it that he had done exactly what he said. He had calculated the risk. He had weighed it against the medical uncertainty and decided that the survey was worth attending. He had probably also calculated the probability that the technician would suppress the film rather than report it, which I do not know how he estimated, but which he had apparently estimated correctly, or he would not have come back in April. I told him that. I said, "You seem to think I would suppress it." He had thought there was a reasonable chance. You watched me walk away from the van, and I recognized the quality of that watching. I asked what he meant. People who are about to report something unusual go back inside to document it. They do not watch it leave. But I had watched. That meant I was still deciding, and people who are still deciding usually decide in the direction they were already leaning. And something about the quality of my watching had told him I was leaning toward keeping it. He had been 61 years old, by his own reckoning, and he had been navigating a world that would have destroyed him if it had found him for the entirety of those 61 years. He had developed a fluency in reading people that I had never thought about from the other side. I was the one being read, and I had apparently been legible to him in the moment I thought I was observing him neutrally. That is the thing I return to most often when I think about that conversation. Not the extra ribs or the bone density or the father born in 1850. The fact that he had read me correctly from 30 feet in the time it took me to watch him walk to the bend in the road, and had based his decision to come back in April on what he had seen in my posture and my gaze. The precision of that, and what it implied about how long he had been doing it. I never saw Caleb Holt again. What I did do, in the years that followed, was conduct a kind of private investigation using the tools available to me in my professional capacity. This was not systematic research in any formal sense. I did not write it down, did not collect findings in a dossier, did not approach it with the rigor that a scientist would bring to a problem. What I did was pay attention, in the quiet, ongoing way that a person can pay attention to something over a long career if they have a reason to. The University of Kentucky Medical Center, where I worked from 1955 until my retirement in '91, was a teaching hospital and research institution of genuine regional significance. In the bone imaging suite, which was my domain, I processed thousands of skeletal films over those decades, chest films by the tens of thousands, full skeletal surveys for oncology patients, for metabolic bone disease workups, for the investigation of dysplasias and dysostoses, the disorders of skeletal development that produce abnormal bone architecture. I became, without planning it, one of the more experienced radiographic technicians in the state at recognizing variations in skeletal structure that fell outside the normal human range. This expertise had legitimate clinical uses. I was occasionally asked to review films from smaller facilities in the region, community hospitals and county health departments that did not have the same depth of experience in their imaging departments. This gave me access, over the years, to a sample of radiographic output from across Kentucky and, on a few occasions, from Tennessee and West Virginia, that was broader than most technicians in my position would have seen. I was not looking for Caleb Holt. I want to be clear about that. He was a specific individual in a specific place, and I was not conducting a search for him or for others like him. What I was doing was something subtler. I was maintaining a frame of reference, a set of criteria in the back of my attention, so that if I saw something that matched what I had seen in that survey van in October of '52, I would recognize it. In 36 years at UK, I encountered two films that gave me pause. The first was in the winter of 1964, a chest film from a referral case, a man who had been seen at a small hospital in Breathitt County, my partner Beverly's home county, and whose film had been sent to UK for a second read on a finding in the right lower lobe that the local radiologist had thought might represent early cavitation consistent with reactivation tuberculosis. The finding was, in fact, a vessel overlap artifact, something the local radiologist had correctly identified as a possibility. I cleared the case and sent my report back, but before I did, I spent several minutes looking at the skeletal structures in that film. The ribs were within normal range, 12 pairs, standard organization. The bone density was high, but not dramatically so, within the upper range of what I had seen in healthy, physically active young men. The man's age on the referral form was listed as 27. The clavicles were somewhat long, though not beyond what variation in normal human anatomy could account for. If I had seen that film before October of '52, I would have filed it and thought nothing of it. Having seen what I had seen, I looked at it for a long time. I was looking for the quality of the cortical opacity, the precise degree of radiographic brilliance that I had observed in Caleb Holt's images. What I saw in this film was not quite that. The density was elevated, but it did not have the same character. It was a different degree, a different quality. I could not say with certainty whether what I was seeing in that 64 film represented the same biological inheritance at a lower expression. A person who carried some component of it but not the full complement, or whether it was simply a normally dense skeleton in a young, active man. I sent the report. I noted the case in a private journal I had begun keeping in a locked drawer of my desk. The journal, I should explain, was not anything that would have been recognizable as an investigation to anyone who read it. It was written in a form that looked like technical notes, observations about radiographic technique and image quality. Because I was genuinely making technical notes alongside the private observations, and I could not separate them in the writing. If anyone had found and read that journal, they would have seen a radiographer's ongoing professional reflections, with occasional notations about unusual image qualities that were not separately categorized or identified. Only I knew what the notations marked. The second film was in 1972. This one was a full skeletal survey, not a chest film alone. An adult woman, age listed as 41, referred by a clinician in Mingo County, West Virginia, for evaluation of a suspected skeletal dysplasia. The referring physician had noted on the form that the patient's bones appeared, on plain films taken for an unrelated injury, to have an unusual structural density, and that the architectural pattern in the trabecular bone visible in those plain films was atypical. He was concerned about a rare form of skeletal sclerosis, possibly osteopetrosis, which is a group of conditions in which bone remodeling is disrupted and the skeleton becomes abnormally dense and, in the classic form, abnormally fragile. Osteopetrosis was not what I was looking at. I knew that within the first 3 films of the survey, osteopetrosis produces a characteristic pattern sometimes called marble bone disease, in which the density is uniform and featureless, the normal trabecular architecture obliterated by the failure of the cells that should be resorbing old bone. What I was looking at was dense bone that had preserved its architecture, trabecular organization that was intact and functional in appearance, a cortex that was brilliant but not featureless. It looked, in the long bones and the flat bones of the pelvis, the way Caleb Holt's ribs had looked, dense to an unusual degree, architecturally organized, implying function rather than disease. The woman's name on the referral form was a West Virginia name, the kind of surname common in the coal country of Mingo County. She had listed her address as a rural route. I noticed that the way a person notices the details that match a pattern they have been quietly maintaining for 2 decades. Her rib count on the survey was 12. Standard. Whatever she carried differently from Caleb Holt in that specific metric. I sent a report that described the findings as consistent with a high normal bone density variant of uncertain genetic origin, not meeting criteria for any recognized skeletal dysplasia, and recommended no further workup unless the patient developed symptoms of bone fragility or compression neuropathy, which were the clinical concerns in true sclerotic bone disease. I noted the case in the journal. I never saw a third film that matched the pattern. Not in the remaining 19 years of my career. 2 films in 36 years. One that was ambiguous and one that was more suggestive, and neither one conclusive in the way that the original Letcher County films had been conclusive. Whatever was out there in the mountain counties, moving quietly through a world that had stopped being careful enough to make space for it, it was not coming to X-ray machines with enough regularity to leave a traceable pattern. Or perhaps the most careful among them had learned the lesson that Caleb Holt had already learned before 1952, which was that appearing in a clinical imaging context, even for a practical purpose like confirming the health of your lungs, carried risks that had to be weighed against the benefit. Perhaps after the post-war period, as imaging technology improved and medical documentation became more systematic and the state and federal health databases became more interconnected, the calculation Caleb Holt had made in October of '52 became less favorable. Perhaps those who remained chose to get their health information through means that did not leave a record on film. I cannot know. What I can say is that those 2 films in the journal drawer and the original 2 in the archival box are the entirety of the radiographic evidence I encountered in a career of over 4 decades. It is not much. It is also not nothing. What I did instead was think about him. I thought about him for the remaining year and a half that I worked for the health department, and I thought about him after I left the survey units in 1955 to take a hospital position in Lexington, and I thought about him through the years of my career as a diagnostic radiographer at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, where I worked until my retirement in 1991. I thought about him in the specific, technical way that a radiographer thinks, which is to say, I thought about his skeleton, about what I had seen and what it implied. Let me tell you what I know about bone density, because it matters for understanding what I was looking at on those films. Cortical bone is the dense, compact outer layer of bone, the shell that gives bones their structural strength and their opacity on X-ray. In a healthy adult human being, cortical density is determined by genetics, nutrition, hormonal environment, and mechanical loading, meaning the forces that bones experience through activity and weight-bearing. High cortical density in a young adult typically indicates excellent nutrition and high levels of weight-bearing activity. The densest bones in the general human population tend to be found in athletes, particularly in sports that involve high-impact loading like running or contact sports. Even at the high end of normal human variation, however, there is a ceiling. Bone cannot exceed a certain density because it is living tissue, not stone, and it requires vascular channels running through the cortex to supply the osteocytes, the cells that maintain the bone matrix. Too much density, and those channels close off and the bone becomes brittle. What I was looking at in Caleb Holt's films was density that exceeded what I understood to be the human ceiling. Not by a slight margin, by a margin that I could not quantify precisely without dedicated densitometry equipment, which I did not have in the back of a survey truck, but which was apparent in the visual quality of the image. The cortex of each rib was radiographically brilliant, suggesting a structural material with higher radiodensity than standard human cortical bone. And yet, the bone was clearly functional. The structural organization was correct. There was no evidence of pathological calcification, no periosteal reaction, no signs of the brittleness that would be expected if the density had been achieved at the cost of vascular supply. The only framework that made sense of this, and I arrived at it slowly over many years of working with bone images in a clinical setting, was that the skeletal material in Caleb Holt's chest was not human cortical bone that had become unusually dense. It was a different material, or a variant of the same material that operated under a different biological set of parameters. A biology that could produce a denser bone matrix while maintaining the vascular architecture required for living tissue. A biology, in short, that had evolved under different constraints than human biology had. I spent time during my years at UK reading whatever was published on bone biology and mineral metabolism. This was the 1960s and 70s, and the field was advancing rapidly as imaging technology improved. I read about osteocalcin and hydroxyapatite and the mechanisms of bone remodeling. I read about cases of unusually high bone density in certain population isolates, specifically a study I encountered in the late 1970s about a family cluster in a rural area of Connecticut, where several individuals had been found to have bone density readings that were substantially above the upper range of the reference population. The individuals were otherwise healthy and apparently normal in all other measured parameters. The researchers attributed the finding to a rare gain-of-function mutation in the LRP5 gene, which is a low-density lipoprotein receptor-related protein that plays a role in bone mineral regulation. In the Connecticut cluster, the mutation appeared to suppress the normal signaling pathway that limits bone deposition, resulting in continuous, unchecked bone formation throughout life. The individuals with this mutation did not suffer the fractures and complications that might be expected because some compensating mechanism, not fully understood at the time, maintained the vascular channels in the cortex. I filed that paper in a drawer with a copy of the annotation I had made on it. I want to be precise about the limitations of what I could determine from radiographic film in a non-research context, because those limitations are real and they matter. A standard chest radiograph in the 1950s produced a two-dimensional shadow image of three-dimensional structures. What I was reading in the Letcher County films was a composite shadow. The bones and soft tissues of the chest superimposed on each other and collapsed into a single plane. Rib counting from that kind of image is reliable for the ribs that are clearly visible and distinct, but in a dense skeleton where the shadows of posterior and anterior rib segments overlap, the count can be complicated. I made my count 3 times. Each time I counted 13 pairs. I had been counting ribs on films for 3 years by that point, and had counted them, by any rough estimate, on a few hundred films. I was confident in my count, but I want to acknowledge that a trained radiologist, with more experience than I had at 23, might have approached the same film with tools and techniques that could have qualified or modified what I saw. I was a technician, not a diagnostician. My read of that film was the read of someone who understood the image technically, but was not credentialed to interpret it medically. What I did have, and what I did not doubt, was my sense of the cortical density. That did not require the same level of interpretive training as rib counting. The bones in that film were simply bright as bones are not. A radiographer develops, over time, an almost tactile sense of what a normal film looks like. A calibration built from the accumulation of thousands of images that sets a baseline against which variations register. The bones in Caleb Holt's films were off that baseline in a direction and to a degree that my calibration registered as significant. That perception was not quantified. I did not have densitometry equipment in the back of a survey truck, but neither was it vague or impressionistic. It was the clear registration of something that did not match the reference class I had built over 3 years of daily film production. The clavicle length was the most straightforwardly measurable anomaly, because the clavicles were fully visible in the image from end to end, and their length relative to the film dimensions could be estimated with reasonable confidence. I have done that estimation several times over the years, using the known film dimensions as a scaling reference and the best approximation I could make of the image magnification factor, which in contact radiography of the type we were doing was close to 1:1 at the distances we used. My estimate, refined over repeated recalculations, is that the visible clavicle length was between 8 and 9 inches per side. A human clavicle at the very long end of normal variation might reach 7 inches. The clavicles in that film were longer than any I have seen on any other film before or since, including the films of some very large men I imaged over the course of my career. The precision of these estimates is limited by the conditions under which the films were produced and by my own training at the time. What those limitations do not change is the fundamental character of what I observed. A skeleton that was organized like a human skeleton, but that was not a human skeleton in all its dimensions and structures. I have not constructed that conclusion from ambiguous data. I have lived with that film for 71 years and the conclusion has not changed. In the decades since, I have followed the imaging literature with the attention of someone who had a personal reason to care. The advances in imaging technology over the second half of the 20th century were substantial. Computed tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, quantitative computed tomography for bone densitometry, dual-energy X-ray absorptiometry. By the late 1980s, the techniques for characterizing bone mineral density had become precise enough that the kind of rough assessment I had been making from plain film could be replaced by exact quantitative measurement. I read the papers on reference ranges for bone mineral density as they were published, and I followed the literature on genetic determinants of bone mass that developed through the 90s and into the current century. The reference range literature was what gave me the framework I had lacked in the early years. By the time I retired in '91, the established upper limit of normal bone mineral density in the human reference population, measured by quantitative computed tomography of the lumbar spine, was in a range that researchers sometimes described as a ceiling imposed by the biology of vascular bone, the requirement to maintain blood vessel channels through the cortex. Values above that ceiling were associated with pathological states, most of them clearly disease processes. The gap between the normal ceiling and where I estimated the Letcher County films to have been was substantial, not a gap that could be bridged by natural variation in normal human genetics. The Connecticut findings described density values in the highest affected individuals that were perhaps 30% above the upper limit of normal reference range. What I had seen on Caleb Holt's films would have been, by rough comparison, somewhere in the range of twice the normal cortical density, perhaps more. The Connecticut cluster was a step in the right direction conceptually, but it did not account for what I was looking at. The LRP5 mutation, in its known form, could not produce the readings I had seen. I retired in '91 and moved to a smaller house in the countryside east of Lexington, near the town of Winchester, where my wife Ellen had grown up and where we still had family. My career in diagnostic radiology at UK had been a long and satisfying one. I had worked with bone images for over 30 years, had supervised the training of dozens of technicians, had contributed to 3 papers on imaging technique, and had accumulated a body of knowledge about the radiographic appearance of the human skeleton that I was confident was as deep as anyone in the state. And through all of it, through every chest plate and every bone scan and every densitometry study I had ever been involved in producing, I had never seen anything that came close to what I had seen in the back of Survey Unit 7 on the afternoon of October 14th, 1952. The 2 films went into a flat archival box when I retired. I had mounted them on cardstock years earlier to protect them from damage, and the box lived on the top shelf of the closet in my home office, behind a row of binders from my years at UK. Ellen knew the box was there. She knew it contained X-ray films that I considered important. She did not know what was in them. I had not told Ellen about Caleb Holt, not because I did not trust her, but because I had made a decision in a Kentucky churchyard in April of '53 that the information belonged to the person whose body it depicted, and that decision had not changed in the 40 years since. Ellen passed away in 2003. We had been married for 51 years. After that, I was alone in the house near Winchester with the archival box and whatever time remained to me, and I began to think about what should happen to the films. I was 74 when Ellen died. I am 94 now. I have had more time to think about this than I expected. I have also had, in the past decade, something that gave me a framework for what I was looking at in those films that I did not have for most of my career. In 2014, I came across an article published in a genetics journal that I had been receiving since my years at UK. The article was about a study of ancient DNA extracted from fossil specimens, and it described genetic markers in those specimens that were associated with bone mineral density, and it described a set of variants in those markers that were found at low frequencies in modern human population samples from North America and from certain isolated communities in parts of Asia and Siberia. The variants, when present, were associated with bone density readings that clustered, in the study population, significantly above the normal human reference range. The researchers noted that the pathway through which these variants operated appeared to be distinct from the known LRP5 pathway, suggesting a different evolutionary origin. The article used terminology that was careful and technical and that was careful and measured in its language. But the variants they were describing had been identified by reference to a set of ancient specimens, and the ancient specimens had a designation in the paper that corresponded to a lineage that is, in the scientific literature, associated with a genetic population that predates the anatomically modern human populations of the regions in question by a very considerable margin. I sat in my chair by the window that looks out toward the field, and I read that article 3 times. Then I went to the closet and took down the archival box and looked at those films again. At 94, my eyesight is not what it was in 1952, but I can still read a chest plate. I clipped the October film to the window light the natural light through the glass. And I looked at those ribs and those clavicles and that cortical density, and I thought about a man born in 1991, by his own accounting, who appeared to be 35, whose mother had 12 ribs per side and whose father had 14, and who lived on a rural route in the upper Elkhorn Creek drainage in Letcher County, Kentucky, in a house a mile from the end of a road that a mail carrier named Arvin Combs had never walked to the end of. I thought about what Earl Stidham had said at Mrs. Gabbard's dinner table. The old ones, here before the first white man, before the Cherokee, before anybody, standing at the tree line watching him clear a skid road and then turning and going back into the trees when the interaction was complete. I thought about what Caleb Holt had said in the churchyard. My mother had 12, the same as you. I want to be careful here about what I am claiming and what I am not claiming. I am not claiming to have a definitive scientific explanation for what I saw on those films. I am not claiming to have identified Caleb Holt as a member of a specific species or population. I am not claiming that the genetics article I read in 2014 proves anything about the man who stood in the back of my survey van in 1952. What I am claiming is this: that the radiographic evidence I documented, which I retain, and which has not been seen by any physician or researcher in the 71 years since I removed it from that development tank, is consistent with a skeletal biology that cannot be accounted for by any known human genetic variation, and that the man whose skeleton produced that evidence knew what he was, had thought carefully about whether to allow himself to be documented, and ultimately chose to trust me with the information about his own biology in a brief conversation under some sycamore trees in a churchyard in eastern Kentucky, and then walked away and went back to his hollow and his house a mile from the road. I do not know whether Caleb Holt is still living. By his own accounting, he was 61 in 1953, which would make him 132 now by strict calendar reckoning. By his accounting of his own biology, the schedule is different. His father appeared in his late middle years at what was, in calendar terms, an age of over 80. Caleb himself appeared to be in his 30s at what he said was 61. If that proportion holds, if the physical presentation is compressed by roughly half relative to calendar age, then the question of what 132 years represents in physical terms for someone of his lineage is one I cannot answer. What I can tell you is that in the summer of 1998, I drove to Letcher County for the first time since the early 1950s. I was 69 years old. Ellen was still alive and had initially proposed coming with me before a knee problem changed her plans, and I drove alone down through the mountains to Jenkins and then up the road along Elkhorn Creek. The road had been improved since the 50s. It was paved now, a narrow two-lane with a painted center line that disappeared in places where the pavement had cracked and heaved from frost. The communities along the creek were smaller than I remembered them, quieter, the mining economy having collapsed through the 80s and taken most of the population with it when the young people left. I drove north of Jenkins toward Eolia, and I found the church where we had set up in April of '53. Still white, though the paint was worn and there was a new aluminum roof where the old wood shingles had been. The parking lot was gravel still, and the sycamore trees along the fence line were enormous now, 45 years of growth having turned the slender trees I remembered into substantial specimens with the mottled bark and heavy limbs characteristic of old sycamores. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a while. The hollow that led up toward the rural route drainages above Jenkins was visible from where I sat, a dark gap in the ridge where the road turned and vanished into the tree canopy. I sat and looked at it. I did not drive up the hollow. I thought about it, and then I decided not to. I had promised him nothing formally. Our conversation had been about the film, about what I intended to do with it, and I had told him I intended to keep it without producing it in any official context. I had not made any promise about never seeking him out, but I felt, sitting in that parking lot looking at the gap in the ridge, that the spirit of what had passed between us in that churchyard included an understanding that I would not go looking. He had found me, both times, on his terms. He had come to the van. He had stayed in line. He had walked up to me in the sycamore shade. That had been his choice. Going up that hollow would be mine, and it would be a different thing. I drove back to Winchester. I have thought about that decision many times in the years since. Whether it was the right one, whether an alternative might have led somewhere useful, whether there was knowledge to be gained that I forfeited by turning around. But when I try to construct the alternative, the version where I drive up that hollow and find the house a mile from the road and knock on the door, I cannot make it feel like the right story. The right story was the one where a man who had spent his life being careful about what he allowed the world to know about him made a choice. Twice, in October and April, to come and stand in a line with ordinary people and present himself to a health survey, and then made a different choice, in April, to have a conversation with the technician who had seen his film. That was what he had offered, and what he had offered was enough. Let me tell you about the bone density one more time, because I have thought about it for so long that I want to put it plainly before I am done. Normal cortical bone in a healthy adult has a calcium hydroxyapatite mineral content of approximately 65 to 70% of bone mass by weight. This is the mineral component that makes bone radiopaque on X-ray, that makes it show up as white on the image. The remainder is organic matrix, primarily collagen, which is what gives bone its flexibility and resistance to fracture. The ratio matters. Too much mineral and the bone becomes brittle and inflexible. Too much organic matrix and it becomes too soft to bear load. The human ratio has been refined over millions of years of evolutionary pressure into something that balances strength, flexibility, and weight. What I observed on Caleb Holt's films suggested a mineral content that was higher than the normal human range, substantially higher, and yet the structural organization of the bone, the trabecular architecture that I could partially discern in the images, did not show the patterns of brittleness or pathological change that an excess of mineralization produces in human bone. The structure was dense and brilliant and architecturally organized, implying function, structural integrity, a material that was operating correctly at that density rather than malfunctioning. The only way that makes biological sense is if the organic matrix component had also been modified. If the ratio was different not because the mineral content had been increased without compensation, but because both components had been recalibrated to a different equilibrium, one that produced a denser material while preserving the functional qualities that made bone useful for the structure it supported. That is not a modification that can be achieved by a single gene variant. That is a modification that reflects a deep evolutionary divergence, a long independent trajectory, a lineage that had been refining that equilibrium for a very long time under selection pressures that were different from those that shaped the human skeleton. I have read what has been published about the genetics of archaic human lineages over the past 20 years with more than casual interest, as you might imagine. The sequencing of ancient genomes has produced a picture of the human past that is more complex and more layered than anything that was imagined when I was doing survey work in Kentucky in the 1950s. We know now that the lineages which preceded and overlapped with anatomically modern humans did not simply disappear. They introgressed. They contributed genetic material to the modern human gene pool in ways that are still being characterized, and the functional implications of that introgressed material are still being worked out. The variants associated with unusual bone mineral density that I encountered in the 2014 paper were described as archaic introgression, which is the technical term for genetic material inherited from ancestral populations that mixed with early modern humans before the older population was absorbed or went extinct. Except that extinction and absorption are two different things. Absorption means the genetic material persists, but the population, as a distinct group of individuals, ceases to exist. Extinction means the same. In both cases, the assumption is that the population is gone, that what remains is only genetic trace, ghost lineages detectable in modern genomes but no longer present as living individuals. What if that assumption was wrong in at least some cases? What if, in some of the most remote and least accessible terrain on the continent, in hollows at the end of roads that mail carriers had never walked to the end of, there were individuals who represented not the trace of a vanished lineage, but the continuation of one? Not many. Not enough to constitute a population in any robust demographic sense, but enough. Some. A man born in approximately 1891 in a cabin on an upper drainage in eastern Kentucky, whose father had been born in approximately 1850 and died in 1938, at what appeared to be the physical age of perhaps 50, whose mother had been a human woman from the mountains who had lived and died on the expected human schedule. A man who had stood in line twice at a state health department survey van, once to confirm the health of his lungs, and once to find out what I intended to do about what I had seen. I cannot prove any of this. The films are evidence of something, but they are not evidence that can be submitted to a court or a journal without the testimony of a physician who has reviewed them, and I never showed them to a physician. My testimony about what they show is the testimony of a trained and experienced radiographic technician, not a licensed diagnostician, and in any formal context that distinction matters. The films themselves would need to be authenticated, and their chain of custody, which runs from a survey truck in Letcher County in October of 1952 to an archival box in a closet in Winchester, Kentucky, is not the kind of chain of custody that satisfies the standards of a scientific publication. What they are, the films, is a record, a private record kept by a man who made a decision about what he was going to do with knowledge that was not his to distribute, and kept that decision for 71 years. I made arrangements last year to ensure the films do not simply disappear when I am gone. I have identified 2 individuals who I trust. One a former colleague from UK and one a person I will not name who works in a relevant scientific field, and I have told each of them separately what the films contain and where they are and under what conditions I would want them produced. The conditions are simple. If a context exists in which they can be reviewed by someone with the appropriate expertise, in a setting where the review can be conducted without triggering a government or law enforcement response, and where the purpose of the review is genuine scientific understanding rather than documentation for any official purpose, then the films may be examined. If that context never arises, the films may go with me. And what I saw in the back of that survey truck stays a private record. I lean toward hoping the context arises. I have been 94 years old for 3 months now, and while I am not in immediate decline, I am also not operating under any illusions about the distance between here and the end. The films have been with me for 71 years, and I would like to see them in the right hands before I no longer have any hands to put them in. The years between that drive in '98 and my retirement from active reading were years in which I thought about the films more often than I had expected to. I had believed, in some part of myself, that once I made the drive to Letcher County and chose not to go up the hollow, I would have resolved something, that the physical act of returning to the place and making a choice would settle the question that 45 years had not settled. What the drive did was replace the abstracted, memory-softened version of the place with a specific and present reality, and that made the question more concrete, not less. I went back in 2008, a decade after the first drive, and by then I was 79 years old, driving a newer car on roads that had improved further, carrying a better map of the county than I had possessed in '53. The coal economy that had been declining in the '90s had declined further through the 2000s, and the communities along Elkhorn Creek were quieter still. Several of the businesses I had seen in '98 were shuttered. The post office in Jenkins had reduced its hours. The landscape was the same. The steep ridges and the narrow creek bottoms and the old-growth timber that survived in the upper drainages because no road had ever been built to reach it profitably. But the human infrastructure had thinned out. I drove past Eolia. The Holiness Church was there. The parking lot was empty. a weekday in October, and the sycamore trees along the fence line were larger than I had estimated from memory. The aluminum roof from '98 had been replaced again with something new. The hand-lettered sign was gone, replaced with a painted one. I slowed down when I passed, but did not stop. I drove north to where the road crossed the creek for the third time above Jenkins. And there, on the left side of the road, where a gravel turnout had been worn into the verge, was a wooden post. It was weathered and gray, and whatever box had been on it was gone. Just the post, with the bracket hardware still attached, rusted to the color of dried blood. No mailbox, no identifying information, just the post in the verge. At the turn where the hollow opened up behind it, I stopped the car. I sat there for a few minutes looking at the post and at the opening of the hollow behind it. The hollow was dark even at midday, the canopy still thick with late-season foliage in the upper reaches. The track leading into it was not visible from the road. Whatever path had once led from the post to the house a mile back was not something I could see from where I sat. Then I drove on. I did not stop again. The post bothered me in a way I could not fully articulate. A mailbox bracket with no mailbox was not unusual in that part of the county, where rural delivery had been declining for years, and many people had consolidated their mail at post office boxes in town. But I had been thinking about that post and that mailbox since Arvin Combs's letter in the winter of '52, and arriving to find it empty felt like a message I had not been sent in time to receive. What I mean is this: a mailbox on a post implies current use. Someone maintaining a delivery address, someone receiving correspondence, someone whose existence is documented in the postal system as an addressable person at a specific rural route. When the mailbox is gone and only the bracket remains, that documentation has been withdrawn. The person at the end of the track has either moved or died, or chosen to stop being findable by the postal system. If Caleb Holt had been born in approximately 1891 and was, by his own accounting, 61 years old in the spring of 1953, then in the fall of 2008 he would have been, by strict calendar reckoning, 117 years old. By his own description of his biology, the physical reality of that 117 years might look very different from what a strict calendar reckoning would suggest. His father, born approximately 1850 and dead in 1938 at calendar age 88, had not appeared to age at anything close to normal human rates. Caleb had appeared to be in his mid-30s at calendar 61. If the differential held, a calendar age of 117 might correspond to a physical presentation somewhere in late middle age by human reference. That was possible. I could not know. What I could know was that the box was gone and the bracket remained, and the track into the hollow was not visible from the road. I drove back to Winchester, and I did not go to Letcher County again. In the years that followed, I read the new genetics literature with intensifying interest, and what I read changed the shape of the questions I had been carrying. The ancient DNA work was the thing that mattered most. The sequencing of genetic material recovered from archaic remains, which became technically feasible in the early years of the century and progressively more refined through the 2010s, had by 2014 produced a picture of the human past that the generation of researchers I had been trained alongside would not have recognized. We had known, since the 1970s, that the Neanderthal lineage had overlapped in time and space with anatomically modern humans in Europe and Asia, and that the Neanderthals had gone extinct or been absorbed somewhere around 40,000 years ago. What we had not known, until the ancient DNA work began to bear out, was the extent to which absorbed was the accurate term rather than extinct. Sequencing of modern human genomes revealed that people of European and Asian ancestry carried between 2 and 4% of their genetic material from Neanderthal ancestors. The mixing had been real. It had been extensive enough to leave a detectable trace in the genomes of billions of living people. The Denisovan discovery added a second archaic lineage to the picture. Denisovans were identified initially from a finger bone recovered from a cave in Siberia in 2008, and subsequent sequencing revealed a lineage distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans that had also introgressed into the ancestors of modern Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations, and at lower levels into populations across Asia. Two archaic lineages, each contributing genetic material to modern humans, each formerly believed to be simply gone. And then the analysis of what that introgressed material actually did in the genomes of living people began to produce results that were, in my private and perhaps idiosyncratic reading of them, highly relevant to a set of X-ray films in a flat archival box in my closet. Specific Neanderthal variants associated with immune function. Specific Denisovan variants associated with hypoxia tolerance at high altitude. And, in a subset of studies looking at bone mineral metabolism, variants from archaic sources associated with elevated bone density in modern carriers. The human genome contains many genes involved in bone mineral regulation. The LRP5 gene I mentioned earlier is one. SOST, which encodes a protein called sclerostin that acts as a brake on bone formation, is another. The paper I read in 2014 described variants in SOST and in a related gene called DKK, one that showed signatures of archaic origin in the modern human carriers, meaning the variants were more similar to archaic human sequences than to the variants common in modern human populations, suggesting they had entered the modern human gene pool through introgression, rather than arising within the modern human lineage. And the carriers of these variants had bone density readings that were, in the study population, significantly above the modern human reference range. Significantly above. Not matching what I had seen in the survey van, but pointing in that direction. The paper's authors noted this as an interesting functional consequence of archaic introgression without drawing any broader conclusion about what it implied. They were doing population genetics, not trying to account for the experiences of a retired radiographic technician in Winchester, Kentucky. But I sat in my chair by the window, and I read their careful language, and I thought about 13 pairs of ribs and a mailbox bracket rusted to the color of dried blood on a post at the edge of a hollow in Letcher County, and I thought about what it might mean if the introgressed fraction was not 2% or 4%, but something much closer to 50. The 2014 paper used a term I had not seen in earlier genetics literature. It described the archaic influenced bone density variants as a potential example of adaptive introgression, meaning that the variants had been maintained in the modern human gene pool, not by chance, but because they conferred some advantage that natural selection had preserved. High bone density can be advantageous in environments that impose high physical stress on the skeleton. Environments like, to choose an example that is perhaps not entirely random, the steep terrain of the mountain ranges of the eastern continent, where a skeleton that could absorb the mechanical loads of traversing rough country without fracturing might represent a meaningful fitness advantage. I am not a geneticist. I have been careful in this account not to claim expertise I do not have. What I am doing when I read that paper and draw a line between its findings and what I observed in Letcher County is not science. It is pattern recognition by a person who has spent 71 years looking at one specific data point and searching for a framework that accommodates it. The framework may be wrong. The data point is not. The drive home from Letcher County in '98 was quiet. I was 69 years old, a widower of a few years at that point, though I was not yet thinking of myself clearly in those terms, because the word widower still seemed to require Ellen to have been gone for longer than she had. The loss was recent in all the ways that matter, and the drive gave me too much time to think about it. I had gone to Letcher County with a question and come back without an answer, which was what I had expected and which still felt like the wrong outcome. The question, reduced to its simplest form, was whether Caleb Holt was still alive. I had no way to answer it from Winchester, and I was not willing, in '98, to do the things that might have given me more information. I thought about the county courthouse and the property records, which might show whether the parcel in the upper drainage was still in any name that could be linked to the Holt address. I thought about the county health department and its records, which might have some continuation of the tuberculosis survey documentation from the early '50s. I thought about the regional obituary archives that local newspapers maintained, which might show a death record for a Caleb Holt in Letcher County at some point between April of '53 and the present. I did not pursue any of these. The reason was the same reason I had not driven up the hollow. The spirit of what had passed between us in that churchyard. He had told me about his situation on the understanding that I would keep it. And searching his name in county records, however indirect and private my search might be, would be a step toward making him findable, which was the thing he had spent his entire life avoiding. I could justify it to myself in any number of ways. He had not asked me to avoid looking. I had not promised to stop gathering information. The public records were public, but the justifications rang hollow to me each time I tried them, and after a while I stopped trying them. What I did instead, in the years between '98 and 2008, the internet had arrived in my life slowly, the way it arrived in the lives of most people my age, through a computer in the library first, then through a machine my nephew brought to the house and set up on the desk in the study that had been my home office for decades. The access to published material that it provided was unlike anything I had known, coming from someone who had spent most of his career relying on subscriptions and interlibrary loans and the holdings of the UK Medical Library. I could now find and read papers from journals I had never had access to before, and I could search topics with a specificity that the card catalog had never permitted. I spent a considerable amount of time in those years reading about the taxonomy and population genetics of the great apes, because the apes were the reference class that most of the serious biological thinking about large bipedal primates in North America gestured toward, however obliquely. I read about Gigantopithecus blacki, the enormous ape of the Miocene and Pleistocene that had gone extinct perhaps 100,000 years ago, known only from fossil jaw fragments and teeth recovered in China, Vietnam, and India. By estimate, it was the largest primate ever to exist, standing 9 or 10 feet tall, gone due to climate change and loss of forest habitat. No fossil evidence of it has been found in North America, and that absence is part of the larger point about what the fossil record can and cannot tell us. I read that literature carefully, not because I believed Caleb Holt was a Gigantopithecus, because he was clearly not that, not in morphology and not in any biological sense that I could observe from the evidence available to me. He was bipedal, linguistic, cognitively complex, and had a mother who was fully human. He was not an ape, but the Gigantopithecus literature was useful in a negative sense. It demonstrated the limits of what the fossil record could tell me about what had or had not existed in the North American landscape before and during the period of human habitation. The fossil record for primates in North America is sparse, because primates prefer forested environments, and forest environments do not preserve well. The conditions that produce fossils, arid sites with mineral-rich sediment, abundant sedimentation in geological contexts that preserve bone, are not the conditions that produce forests. Most of what lived in the forests of eastern North America over the past 100,000 years is simply gone without a trace. The absence of fossil evidence for something is not evidence of its absence. That is a principle of paleontology that every introductory course makes clear and that the popular imagination consistently ignores. What the ancient DNA work had added to this picture, by the time I was reading it in the first decade of the 2000s, was a demonstration that the genetic record could survive even where the fossil record had failed. Ancient DNA extracted from a finger bone in a cave could reveal a lineage that the bones themselves had given no hint of. The Denisovan discovery was the proof of concept for this, a population that had been entirely unknown to science, not because it had not existed, but because it had left no remains that anyone had recognized as significant until the DNA in a single small bone was sequenced. A population that had been invisible to 50 years of intensive paleoanthropological investigation suddenly became visible through a fragment of genetic code. If something like that could remain invisible in the cave record of Siberia, where preservation conditions are among the best in the world, the idea that a lineage could persist without fossil trace in the forests of the Eastern American continent was not a stretch. The forests of Appalachia and the Ozarks and the ranges of the mid-continent are not caves in Siberia. They do not preserve bone. The Eastern American landscape is wet, acidic, forested. It is one of the worst possible environments for the preservation of biological remains. A population that had been living in those forests for any significant period would have left almost no trace that modern science could find. That was not speculation. That was geology and taphonomy. There is one more thing I want to tell you. It is not about the films or the radiographic findings or the genetics literature. It is about the churchyard and the sycamore trees and what Caleb Holt said at the end of our conversation in April of 1953 before he turned and walked away. I had told him I intended to keep the film without producing it in any official context. He had said, "All right," and then there was a pause, and he said something else. He said, "You grew up in the coal fields, so you already know this, but I will say it anyway. The things that last in these mountains are the things that people agree to leave alone." I told him I understood that. He said, "My mother used to bring eggs down to a woman in town when she needed a doctor. The doctor kept her confidence the same way the men who found the coal kept the mountain's confidence, by not speaking of what they found to people who would come and take it. I did not respond to this, and he did not seem to expect a response. He adjusted his hat. He said it had been good to meet me. He said he hoped the rest of the survey circuit went well. And then he turned and walked around the corner of the white-framed church, and I did not see him again. I drove back to Frankfurt that evening on roads that followed the creek valleys east and then north, roads I had driven 100 times in those years, past communities that were hanging on and communities that were already letting go, and the mountains were beginning to green up in the April dusk, that particular pale green of new leaves before they darken into summer. And I thought about what he had said. The things that last are the things people agree to leave alone. I have tried to live by that in the 71 years since. I do not think I have done so perfectly. This account is itself a form of speaking, and I have been deliberate about it, have chosen the form and the timing and the degree of detail. I am not naming the specific drainage above Jenkins. I am not providing a GPS coordinate or a property description. I am not reproducing the rural route designation or anything that would let someone with a map and determination locate the place. What I am providing is what happened to me, what I saw, what was said, and what I made of it. If that constitutes a broken confidence, I am prepared to be judged for it. What I am not prepared to do, at 94, is leave the world without having said that. I stood in a churchyard in eastern Kentucky in the spring of 1953, and spoke with a man who was not fully human, and who was one of the most careful and considered and self-possessed individuals I have ever met, who had thought about what it meant to exist in a world that would not understand him and had arrived at a set of conclusions about how to do it that were, as far as I could tell, working, who had a mother who brought eggs to a doctor and a father who was born in 1850 and who had lived in those mountains long before either of them and whose presence in those mountains was, if Earl Stidham's grandfather was right, a fact of the landscape as old as the landscape itself. The film is in the closet. The sycamore trees in that churchyard in Eolia are very large now, and somewhere in the upper Elkhorn drainage, a mile from a road that ends at a post where a mailbox used to be, there may or may not be a house where someone who carries 13 pairs of ribs and exceptional cortical bone density is making decisions about what to allow the world to know about them. I hope those decisions are working out. I hope they are not afraid. I have kept my end of the agreement for 71 years. I will keep it until I cannot anymore. After that, the films will go to the people I have trusted with them. And what happens next will be up to them, and whatever moment they find themselves in. I want to say something about the nature of evidence before I finish, because I am aware that what I have described in this account is not the kind of evidence that science as an institution knows how to handle. Science, as I understood it over a long career working adjacent to it, is a system for producing knowledge that can be shared, verified, and built upon. The requirements of that system, reproducibility, documentation, peer review, mean that knowledge which cannot be shared without causing harm to its source is knowledge that the system cannot process. The films in my closet cannot be submitted to a journal without a chain of events that would constitute a betrayal of the man whose skeleton they depict. The conversation in the churchyard cannot be corroborated because all of the participants are either dead or, in Caleb Holt's case, in a situation where corroboration would require finding him, and I have spent 71 years not finding him. What I have, therefore, is a private record, an account given by a single observer, a technician who is now 94 years old, and who has been telling this story to exactly no one for the entirety of his career. The epistemological status of that account is not good. I know that. I have known it since the moment I pulled the film from the development tank and understood what I was looking at. I have known that the thing I was seeing was something that could not, in any ordinary sense, be proven by the seeing of it. But I have also come to believe, in the 71 years of carrying it, that the question of whether it can be proven is not the only question worth asking. The other question is simpler and older. What did I see? And that question I can answer. I saw a chest radiograph that showed 13 pairs of ribs, cortical bone density that I cannot account for within normal human variation, and clavicles longer than any I have seen on any other film in a career of over 4 decades. I saw a man who stood in line at a church parking lot in Letcher County, Kentucky, on 2 separate occasions 7 months apart, and who walked to the edge of the churchyard with me and told me, in precise and considered language, that his mother had 12 pairs of ribs and his father had 14, and that by the calendar he was 61 years old, though he looked 35. I saw those things. They happened. What they mean, and what implications they carry for the larger questions they gesture toward, is something I have been less certain about over the years than I was in the immediate aftermath. In the spring of '53, I was certain I had met a man of genuinely non-human ancestry, and that certainty was clean and sharp in the way that young certainties are. 71 years of living have made the certainty less clean without making it less firm. It is possible to know something and to understand, simultaneously, all the ways in which your knowledge might be wrong. I know what I saw. I understand that what I know could be the result of error, misperception, coincidence, and the operation of my own desire to make sense of something that resisted ordinary sense-making. I have held both of those things at once for most of my life, and I have concluded that the holding of both of them is more honest than the abandonment of either. The films will go to the 2 people I have trusted with this, when I am gone. What happens after that is not something I can control, and I have made my peace with that. I have asked those 2 people to honor the same principle I have tried to honor, which is that the documentation exists to record what happened, not to expose what was protected. Whether they will interpret that as I intend it, I do not know. I believe they will try. That is all I can ask. The sycamore trees in Eolia are large now. The church still stands. The mailbox bracket is rusted on a post at the edge of a hollow in the upper Elkhorn drainage, and somewhere at the end of a track that goes back a mile through timber that was old when Caleb Holt's father was born, there is or was a house where someone lived who had reason to know that the things that last in these mountains are the things that people agree to leave alone. I have left it alone. I am leaving it alone now, as much as this account allows, and I am trusting that the distinction between bearing witness and causing harm is one that the people who receive these words will be able to honor. That is what I have. That is all of it. That is all I have. Every detail exactly as I remember it.